Chapter 15. Goodbye, Grandma. There's still something that you've left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it would be, George said. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in. You'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground, with the spoon in one hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. That tiny, ridiculous brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below her and she shouted, "What's going on around here? Why hasn't anybody brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough to have to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttered toast." "I'm terribly sorry, Mother," Mrs. Cranky said. "We've been very busy. I'll get something for you right away." "Let George get it, the lazy little brute," Grandma shouted. Just then the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid, very much like tea. "Oh-ho!" she cried. "Aha! So that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself, all right, don't you? You make sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you didn't think to bring one to your poor old Grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig." No, Grandma," George said. "This isn't—" "Don't lie to me, boy," the enormous hag shouted. "Pass it up here this minute." "No," cried Mrs. Cranky. "No, Mother, don't. That's not for you." "Now you're against me too," shouted Grandma. "My own daughter, trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out." Mrs. Cranky looked up at the horrible old woman and smiled sweetly. "Of course it's for you, Grandma," he said. "You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot." "Don't think I won't," Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup. "Hand it over, George." No, Grandma," George cried out, pulling the cup away. "You mustn't. You're not going to have it." "Give it to me, boy," yelled Grandma. "Don't," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's George's marvellous—" "Everything's George around here," shouted Grandma. "George's this, George's that. I'm fed up with it." She snatched the cup out of little George's hand and carried it high out of reach. "Drink it up, Grandma," Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. "Lovely tea." "No!" the other two cried. No! But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. "Mother!" wailed Mrs. Cranky. "You've just drunk 50 doses of George's marvellous medicine number 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to that little old brown hen." But Grandma couldn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. "This is going to be interesting," Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. "Now you've done it," cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. "You cooked the old girl's goose." "I didn't do anything," Mr. Cranky said. "Yes, you did. You told her to drink it." There was a tremendous hissing sound that came out above their heads. The steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. "She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam," Mr. Cranky said. "She's going to blow up," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "Her boiler's going to burst." "Stand clear," Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out from the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt the ears. "Call the fire brigade," cried Mrs. Cranky. "Call the police. Man the hose pipes." "It's too late," Mr. Cranky said, looking pleased. "Grandma!" shrieked Mrs. Cranky. "Mother! Run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water." But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped, and the steam disappeared, And that was when Grandma started to get smaller. She had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. "Watch this, George," Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard, flapping his arms. "Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of 1. Very soon Grandma was back at normal height. "Stop," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's just right." But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half a minute she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it always had. Her eyes, now no bigger than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. How do I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget?" "She's still going," shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. "She's still getting smaller." And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and cried, "How do I stop her getting smaller still?" "You can't," said Mr. Cranky. "She's had 50 times the dose." "I must stop her," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "I can hardly see her as it is." "Catch hold of each end and pull," Mr. Cranky said. By then Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then... "Where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. "I've lost her." "Hooray!" shouted Mr. Cranky. "She's gone! She's disappeared completely!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's what happens to you if you're grumpy and bad-tempered," said Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of yours, George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly. By lunchtime she was saying, "Oh, well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance round the house, wasn't she?" "Yes," said Mr. Cranky, "she most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magic world. I do hope you liked that book. It's one of my favourites. I've got some questions to ask to make sure that you've actually been listening. See how much you can remember. Okay, question number 1. What was the first thing that George put into his medicine? Question number 2. What colour does the medicine need to be? What happens when Grandma drinks George's medicine? After his grandma, what animal does George feed his medicine to? What is the name of George's father? Thank you very much indeed for listening. Remember, that was George's Marvellous Medicine by Roald Dahl, and it's a great, great story. See if you can find the book yourself to read.